Collective action problem. Group wants to come together to cooperate, but fail due to each other's individuals' self-interest. Tends to fail due to the poor communication between individuals. Even when members agree to solve a problem or achieve some other collective goal, there is no guarantee that they will find a solution and implement it. Two fundamental barriers: coordination and prisoner's dilemma. Coordination may become problematic when individual members realize that the success of the collective enterprise will require their contribution, may not depend on their costly efforts. 2. Prisoner's dilemma refers to a variety of settings in which the individuals find themselves personally better off by pursuing their private interests and undetermining the collective effort even when they want it to succeed. These include coordination dilemma, free riding, prisoner's dilemma, common pool resource dilemmas, and tragedy of the commons. Next concept. Coordination dilemma is when an organization wants the same goal at the end. However, coordination can be a fault if one of the members realize that the cost effort can ultimately fail. Requires direction and information for it to work. More difficult for large than small groups. Think of the pizza with pineapple, for example, in class, where a small group of friends can decide the toppings easier rather than the whole class together. Coordination problems essentially arise from uncertainty and insufficient information and may prevent collective undertakings even when a great majority agrees in a course of action. Examples: the coordination game and the dating game. Next concept. Free rider problem. A form of prisoner's dilemma. Occurs when a member try to maximize benefit with least amount of effort. Groups are made up of self-interested individuals. In groups, there is an incentive individuals to free ride and shrink responsibility to avoid cost of collective decisions while enjoying rewards. The problem is, if all behave in this manner, then the desired outcome falls apart. Examples: union participation, party planning, school funding. Next concept, prisoner's dilemma. A situation in which two players each have two opinions. Two players have two options whose outcome depends crucially on the simultaneous choice made by the other, often formulated in terms of two prisoners separately deciding whether to confess to a crime. Demonstrates the problem of trust in political decision-making. Cooperation is difficult to achieve. Problems arise because decision-makers must sacrifice something of value to receive payoff. Institutions solves collective action by facilitating communication and instituting rules, alleviating the cost of individual self-interested behavior. Next concept, common pool resource dilemmas. Common pool resource dilemmas emerge from a conflict over limited resources between individual interests and the common good. A common pool resource is a resource that benefits a group of people, but which provides diminished benefits to everyone if each individual pursues his or her own self-interest. The value of common pool resource can be reduced through overuse, because the supplies of the resource is not unlimited, and using more than can be replenished can result in scarcity. Overuse of a common pool resource can lead to the tragedy of the common problem. Examples: fishing or water use. Long-term fish supply is healthier if fish supply is not overly harvested in a given year. Each fish captured increases individual profit, but decreases future fish supply. Formal government solutions and individual and communal solutions. Next concept, tragedy of the commons. When every individual tries to reap the greatest benefit from an open resource, as the demands for the resource overwhelms the supply, each individual who consumes the resource harms the other consumers. At the end, the resource is ruined for all. Clint, sorry, this is the definition I learned from my econ class. Laugh out loud. I hope it makes sense. Example, the ocean is an open resource. Every fisherman is a consumer. The problem is, every fisherman tries to maximize the amount of fish they catch per day. This leads to overconsumption. Since fish cannot reproduce at as fast as fishermen's catching rate, as a result, many species ended up going extinct, and fishermen cannot catch these species anymore. Example, bluefin and tuna, etc. Next concept, public goods. It can be done through taxation from fellow citizens. These goods can be public schools or protecting endangered species. Next concept. Transaction costs. Refers to amount of time and effort invested to understand alternatives, compare preferences, make joint decisions. For example, if my group and I are planning on going to eat out, the transaction cost will be high, while vice versa. If it is just be my sister, the transaction is lower. Next concept. Decision rules. Plurality refers to the most votes. Majority refers to votes exceeding 50%. Supermajority. A supermajority vote is a vote that must exceed the number of votes comprising a simply majority or simple majority. For example, a simple majority is the 100-member Senate is 51 votes, right? While two-thirds supermajority vote requires 67 votes. So a majority would be 51, and a supermajority would be 67 votes. Uniformity and unanimity. Consistent agreements done together. So uni stands for unanimous. Uniformity means consistent agreements done together. Next concept. Articles of Confederation. Flawed because it's had a weak national government. Hard to get laws passed in the office because they needed all 9 colonies to agree. Each state would equal 1 vote. Next concept. The Great Compromise. Arise after the defeat of the AOC. This is the compromise between the power of the federal government and the states. The larger states came up with the Virginia Plan, which gave more power to the states with large populations. However, the smaller states felt oppressed and came up with the New Jersey Plan, which gave equal power to every state. The Great Compromise settled the fight between large states and small states by dividing the Congress into 2 chambers, the House of Representatives and the Senate. House of Representatives represent the Virginia Plan. Larger states have higher number of congressmen, 2-year term, popularly elected. The Senate represents the New Jersey Plan. Every state has an equal number of 2 senators, 6-year term by state legislature. 3/5 compromise. African Americans' vote was counted as 3/5. Next concept. Anti-federalists. These are common folks who benefit from weaker government. They usually are small farmers, debtors, shopkeepers who believe in states' rights. Thomas Jefferson was an anti-federalist. He believed that the central government should not be too strong and ultimately wants more power reserved for the state. Anti-federalists fear tyranny of the minority and favor Bill of Rights, the first 10 amendments. Federalist is the next concept. Federalists are people on the wealthier side who usually are property owners, creditors, merchants. They are often nationalists who support a strong center government. They favor the rule of elite, fear tyranny of the majority, and excessive democracy. Next concept, Bill of Rights. The first 10 amendments that ensure citizens' rights. If you need to know, not sure if you need to know this, but these are the 10 amendments. First, protect freedom of religion, speech, petition, press, and assembly. 2, the right to own guns. 3, the government cannot force people to keep troops in their private homes. 4, protection against unreasonable search and seizure. 5, the right to remain silent, double jeopardy, right to due process. 6, the right to a speedy trial by jury, representation by an attorney for an accused person. 7, guarantees a jury trial for civil cases in the federal courts. 8, prohibits excessive fines and excessive bail and cruel, unusual punishment. 9, give people the rights that are not included in the Constitution. 10, any power that is not given to the federal government is given to the people or the states. Next concept, tyranny of the majority. The potential of a majority to monopolize. Okay, sorry guys. Tyranny of the majority. The potential of a majority to monopolies power for its own gain to the detriment of minority rights and interests. Or, scratch that, the majority government that takes actions benefiting the majority without regards for the rights or welfare of the people. Next concept, checks and balances. A constitutional mechanism giving each branch some oversight and control of the other branches. Example, the presidential veto, Senate approval of presidential appointments, and judicial review of the presidential and congregational actions. Next concept. Necessary and proper clause. A clause of the Constitution setting forth the implied powers of Congress. States that the Congress, in addition to its express powers, has a right to make all laws necessary and proper to carry all powers of the Constitution vests in the national government. Next concept. Full faith and credit clause. A clause in the Article 4 of the Constitution requiring each state to recognize the public acts, records, and judicial proceedings of all other states. Next concept, commerce clause. A clause in the Article 1 of the Constitution that gives Congress the power to regulate interstate and international commerce. Expressed powers and reserved powers. Expressed powers are powers of the federal government that are specifically addressed in the Constitution. Reserved powers are powers of the federal government that go beyond express powers in accordance with the statement in the Constitution that Congress has the powers to make all laws necessary and proper for carrying into execution the powers expressed. So it sounds like reverse powers override express powers. Next concept, judicial review. Job for life, no set number. The power of the courts to determine whether acts of Congress and, by implication, the executive are in accord with the U.S. Constitution established by Marbury versus Madison. Next concept. Selective incorporation. In one law passed through one state equals applied to all states. So selective incorporation. I remember him bringing that up, and it doesn't make sense, the definition here, but I'll reread it. Selective incorporation. If one law passed through one state equals apply all states. Oh, okay, so one law that is passed, even in one state, would apply to all states. That is selective incorporation. Next concept. Separation of powers. Look at the picture. Legislative, executive, and judicial. Legislative branch is making laws. Executive branch is applying and enforcing the law, while the judicial branch is interpreting the law. Next concept. Supremacy clause. I feel like we already did that, but I will go through it in case we did not. Supremacy clause. The Constitution is the supreme law of the land. The Supreme Court is the referee when issues arise between national and state law. Example, McCulloch versus Maryland. Next concept. Block grants. Unfunded mandate. Pursue policy without giving funds. Next concept. Categorical grants in aid. Fund for state to use for a purpose. So it's funds given to a state to use for a purpose. That is a categorical grant in aid. Versus a block grant is unfunded and it's mandated to pursue a policy without giving funds. So there's a difference there. With categorical grants in aid, the public schools and roads, those are giving funds for the states to use for that purpose or those purposes. Next concept, unfunded mandates. In a statute or regulation that requires a state or local government to perform certain actions with no money provided for fulfilling the requirements. This is my own interpretation, but it sounds very similar to the block grants where they're unfunded mandates. So there is a correlation here because block grant says unfunded mandates, and then unfunded mandates also says the same definition, which is regulation that requires a state or local government to perform certain actions with no money provided to fulfill the requirements. So remember, block grants and unfunded mandates are very similar. Next concept, Dual federalism, a system of government in which the federal government and state government each have mutually exclusive spheres of action. So, dual is two. So, that means that there's a mutually shared sphere of power here. So, a system of government in which the federal government and state government each have mutually exclusive spheres of action. So, I would believe just amount of power shared in dual federalism, if that makes sense. Okay, next concept. Cooperative federalism, known as marble cake federalism. Remember that picture with the cake, marble cake? It's kind of just all weaved and swirled in there. Anyways, that cake reference is, for the marble cake reference, is for the cooperative federalism. It's a concept of federalism in which national, state, and local governments interact cooperatively and collectively to solve common problems rather than making policies separately but more or less equally, such as tax, loans, charter banks, and corporations, enforce laws, and administer a judiciary. So cooperative federalism is more of just all of them cooperating, where dual federalism is a federal government and state have mutually exclusive spheres of action. But when we look at cooperative federalism, we're talking about the national and the state and the local governments. Okay? All right, next concept. Laboratories of democracy. Encourages policy experimentation while reducing risk. It creates a marketplace of ideas. People vote with their feet. States that innovate for economic growth. The idea that federalism helps to decentralize our policies, devotion, and this helps to allow states to find different policies to solve the same problem. Next concept. Marketplace of ideas. It's a metaphor for freedom of expression, which states that every idea has its own importance, and it's up to the person to critically evaluate and pass his or her own judgment. It suggests that freedom of expression in the market will eventually lead to the discovery of the truth by society. The first reference to the free trade ideas within the competition of the market appears in Abrams versus United States. So marketplace of ideas, it's just, think marketplace of ideas is freedom of expression. And that means that, people have, they're able to freely express themselves, and people that are receiving these ideas are also free to criticize and evaluate and find their own truth. So think about that. That hopefully sums it up for you. Jim Crow's laws is the next concept. Laws to systematically disenfranchise and segregate blacks, maintain subjugated status, mainly on the southern states, whites only kind of states, where public accommodations such as schools, hotels, and restaurants. Example, whites primary, poll taxes, grandfather clauses, literacy test. That's the Jim Crow laws, remember. Next, we're on a roll, guys. We're almost there. Civil liberties is the next concept. Are protections of citizens from improper government action. So civil liberties are constitutional and legal protections from the government interference into personal rights and freedoms such as the freedom of assembly, speech, and religion. They are freedoms from the government interference in personal liberty. So civil liberties are protections of citizens from improper government action. Plain and simple. Substantive civil liberties. Limits on what the government shall and shall not have the power to do, such as establishing religion or seizing property without compensation. Procedural civil liberties explain how the government is supposed to act in the execution of its authority. Presumption of innocence, trial by jury, double jeopardy. So it looks like for civil liberties, it's civil liberties, substantive civil liberties, and procedural civil liberties. There's differences just slightly on each one. Next concept, civil rights Obligations imposed on government to guarantee equal citizenship and protect citizens from discrimination by other private citizens or other government agencies. Civil rights are the powers or privileges conferred on citizens by the Constitution and the courts, entitling them to make claims on the government. Civil rights protect individuals from arbitrary discrimination at the hands of government or other groups. They protect minorities from discrimination against others. Example of civil rights violations: voting, housing, work, marriage, civil rights of African Americans. The founder James Madison prediction of how democracy will transpire. Federalist Paper number 10, 2 major obstacles in securing rights, a long struggle for over 2 centuries. Those were all just little bullet points, but I don't think those are very important, but that's just my opinion. Okay, next concept, de facto segregation. Segregation that results from practice rather than from law. Next concept, 14th Amendment, intended for protection of black males, but equal protection laws if you are an American citizen. Next concept, Equal Protection Clause. A 14th Amendment clause guaranteeing all citizens equal protection of the laws. The courts have interpreted as a discrimination against minorities and women. Next concept, Plessy versus Ferguson. Separate but okay. Sharing differences. Fountain drinks. Bus seating. Next concept, the separate but equal rule. The doctrine established by Plessy versus Ferguson, that African Americans could constitutionally be kept in separate but equal facilities. So that is the separate but equal rule, the established in Plessy versus Ferguson, and that Plessy versus Ferguson was that African Americans could constitutionally be kept in separate but equal facilities. Next, Brown versus Board of Education. The Supreme Court ruled that separating children in public schools on the basis of race was unconstitutional. Agreed. Literacy test. That was a test nearly impossible to pass, on purpose so not a lot of African Americans can vote. Next. Poll taxes. A tax imposed on people when they register to vote. This happened after the Civil War. This tax was used primarily to disenfranchise black voters. With the passage of the 24th Amendment in 1964, it became unconstitutional. Next concept, the Voting Rights Act, 1965. Federal government intervened within the South, struck down restrictive strategies used in the South. Example, the poll taxes, literacy test, grandfather clause. Got rid of all those. The Voting Rights Act, 1965. The federal government would have oversight over the areas in the South that had very low black voter turnout. It removed citizens having to allege grievances with their state. So the Voting Rights Act of 1965. Federal government intervened within the South, which struck down restrictive strategies used in the South. Next concept, Shelby County versus Holder. 2013 Supreme Court case. 1965 Voting Rights of Act. The provision requiring states to submit proposal and approval from the federal government to change election laws no longer required. Essay. On to the essay questions. How does the government help overcome problems of coordination and collective action? Government resolves collective action problems with lawmaking and policing. Constitution of government creates a set of rules and provides a set of rules prescribing the political process these institutions must follow to reach collective agreements. Government refers to those institutions created and charged with making and enforcing collective agreements. Resources, monitoring, and enforcement costs. Transaction costs. Time and effort invested to understand alternatives, compare preferences, make joint decisions. Conformity costs. The cost of compromise when agreeing to less than ideal policies. formally or informally alter individual preferences to produce desired outcomes. Incentives, punishments, decision-making rules, procedures, fishing licenses and quotas, fines and overuse fees, prison, lawsuits and standing, mandatory compliance, taxation, regularly policy. Next essay question. What is the free rider problem? How does this problem explain the early challenges of U.S. government under the Articles of Confederation? How did the Constitution resolve this problem? The free rider problem occurs when those who benefit from resources, public goods, or services do not pay for them, which results in an under provision of those goods or services. These situations arise when someone benefits if the effort succeeds, even if he or she does not contribute and has little impact on whether the group will succeed or fail. A free rider problem is a collective action problem, and is a situation in which self-interested individuals can receive the benefits from a collective activity, whether they have helped or not. So there is no incentive in contributing. An example of this is a group project where two people might be doing most of the work and research while other person is writing the introduction. Another example is parents who don't vaccinate their children and believe that because there's other children that had their shots, that their child doesn't need to. So, the Articles of Confederation were too weak on their own and ultimately led to a free rider problem from states not paying their debts. Congress was responsible for paying a debt but had no taxation power. In turn, Congress gave each state an annual amount that they must pay in order to pay off their debt. Because Congress has no enforcement mechanism to compel states to make their payments, the only motivation to pay off the debt was a concern from the collective good. This did not compel states to pay off their full amount, and instead, free rider states started relying on other states in hope that they would pay enough of the debt to provide most, if not all, of the collective benefits. This created a domino effect of the prisoner's dilemma, and it became clear that the debt was never going to be fully paid off. The Constitution solved this problem by giving Congress the power to raise taxes directly. This meant that the states would no longer have to raise their own funds for the national government. The national government, in return, would assume and of the states outstanding debt related to war. So the national government, in return, would assume and of the states outstanding debt related to war. This free rider problem is solved by centralizing the ability to raise funds with the national government rather than relying on the states to collect the money. Essay question number 3. What were the major differences between the Federalists and Anti-Federalists? Were these positions reflected in the Virginia Plan, the New Jersey Plan, the Great Compromise, and ultimately the Constitution and the Bill of Rights? And how were the Southern states' perspectives placed in the Constitution? Differences between federalism, and anti-federalism are the Federalists wanted a strong central government, while the Anti-Federalists wanted a weak, centered government. Anti-Federalists wanted a Bill of Rights, while the Federalists wanted a separation of powers. The Federalists were targeting or gaining support from property owners, creditors, and merchants, while the Anti-Federalists were targeting gaining support from small farmers, debtors, shopkeepers. The Federalists favored rule of elite. The Anti-Federalists favored a direct link between government and people. The Virginia Plan proposed a tripartite national government, or tripartite, tripartite, national government. But unlike the subsequent Constitution, it provided for a popularly elected legislature that would dominate national policy making. The New Jersey Plan supported states' rights. Also, it proposed a single chamber and an equal representation for all states. Legislature will have limited power to raise taxes and to regulate commerce. It will also limit the power of National Supreme Court. Eventually, it all led to the Great Compromise, which was an agreement between the large and small states at the Constitutional Convention. It was agreed that the lower chamber will be chosen directly by popular vote and that the upper chamber be selected by the state legislature. Furthermore, representation in the House will be proportional to the state's population. The Senate of each state would have two chambers. The Southern states' perspective argues that slaves' population would be counted for purpose of representation. So, the Southern states' perspective argue that slaves' population should be counted for purpose of representation. So this is how the last sentence I just repeated is how the Southern states' perspective was placed in the Constitution. Fourth essay question. How did the federal government compel states to pass policies that are consistent with national preferences? What tools does the national government have to make states do what it wants? What are the benefits and drawbacks of giving more autonomy to the states? Well, that would be block grants, also an incentive, and it would force them or the government will not provide funded mandate. So I can't elaborate on that. That's all that's on here. Essay question number 5. How does the Constitution address the problem of national government exposed in the United States under the Articles of Confederation? The problem with this was that the government was too weak and able to pass laws. Under the Articles, it needed the support of supermajority, which was 9 out of 13. Even when they did enact laws, the lack of execution branch meant implementation was slow and inefficient. Essay number 6. How does the American system of checks and balances prevent the concentration of power in any single branch of government? It kept the branches from abusing power and creating errors. Each branch has its own duties, such as the executive branch can veto or enforce laws, propose laws to Congress, submits the federal budget to the House of Representatives, and it appoints federal officials who carry out and enforce laws. The legislative branch enacts nation's laws. It can override president's veto with 2/3 votes. The judicial branch interprets laws in reference of the Constitution and interprets controversial laws. They are appointed by the President and approved by the Senate. Number 7 essay. Who supported the inclusion of Bill of Rights in the Constitution? Why did they believe it was so important? Well, the Anti-Federalists supported the Bill of Rights. They believed it was important because they wanted that power with the state and local governments. The lack of the Bill of Rights on the Constitution, since it would place a limit to the power that government had. The lack of the Bill of Rights on the Constitution, since it would place a limit to the power that government had. Number 8. Skip. Number 9. Essay question. Final. Last. Fin. What are the benefits of federalism? Please identify and discuss the economic, cultural, and policy goods of federal government. What are the benefits of federalism? Economic benefits of federalism. Common currency, central bank, common market. The national government compels states to contribute to the cost of producing public goods. National defense, clean air, immigration control. It also protects regional, cultural, religious, or ethnic minorities. It provides regionally concentrated minority groups voice in national government. It increases the participation of citizens by not giving more power to the government, instead shared the power to the state governments, which then are closer to the level of common citizens.